Chapter 11. Arjuna. Chapter text. Arjuna Balaji slept very well after the audition. She wanted to make sure she was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed first thing in the morning so that she could see the results first thing. Then she could properly scope out her competition, brush up on braising and sautéing, and memorize all the recipes she could before the first round of the contest. Arjuna had been confident from the start that she would get a spot in the Magicef junior competition. Her mother had taught her everything she knew about cooking, and Arjuna had earned 3 blue ribbons in local cooking competitions. She'd even once met Ramsay long before he became her teacher at Flourish and Blatz. He'd signed her copy of his cookbook, Transfiguring Flavor. Arjuna headed up to bed before anyone else that night, even her friend and doormate Astoria Greengrass, who had also auditioned. Arjuna knew Astoria would do well, but they both knew full well that they wouldn't go easy on each other. If nothing else, Arjuna had a suspicion what Astoria might want the 5,000 galleon prize money for. I could always give her some of the money when I win, Arjuna comforted herself. Papa doesn't need it. We've got more than enough. When she reached the 4th-year Ravenclaw girls' dorm, Arjuna closed the door behind her, sitting down on her neatly made bed and pulling out the top dresser drawer. She took out some candles and lit them one by one with the tip of her wand. Once the smell of jasmine fully permeated the room, she fetched the small crystal ball she'd bought in the apothecary at Diagon Alley from her suitcase and sat down on her bed, cradling the ball in her hands and allowing her mind to go blank. Arjuna loved the idea of divination even before she attended Hogwarts. It had always seemed so ethereal and otherworldly. She'd really fallen in love with it, however, after starting the class last year with Professors Trelawney and Ferenza. After telling her mother about it, she found out that there was actually some seer blood in their veins, as Arjuna's great-grandmother had apparently been one. Arjuna sometimes laughed to Astoria that was why she was so good at guessing the correct answers on pop quizzes. After a moment of meditating and rocking the crystal ball back and forth in her hands, Arjuna placed it gently on the bedspread in front of her and gazed into it. The mist in the crystal ball was moving. Was that an opening gate? A gate for opportunity. But what was in the gate? Triangular ears, a tail. Was it a cat? Arjuna squinted at the strange cat-like shape, confused. Cats in scrying terms tended to represent deceit. Would someone cheat in the competition? The cat scurried around a bottle, its tail trailing like smoke around it, before darting away in fear. A bottle. Success, maybe. Arjuna considered the crystal ball carefully, her dark eyes running over the glass thoughtfully. Looks like someone will cheat in the competition, but the cheater will not win. Arjuna smiled wryly. That was fine by her. She would certainly never cheat after all. Guess all I have to do is figure out who's going to cheat, she thought to herself. Logically speaking, it's likely to be a Gryffindor or a Slytherin. They always are the most brutal when they want to win something, and Hufflepuffs hate cheating, by and large. Astoria's face rippled through Arjuna's memory. Sorry, I follow things in the real world. Predicting things like that is just too woolly for my taste. Arjuna bit her lip. She had to remember to be cautious with her interpretation. Even Professor Ferenza personally saw all wizarding methods of fortune-telling unreliable and only followed the stars. And she certainly hoped that no one would cheat in the competition. Still turning her theory over in her head, Arjuna carefully put away her crystal ball and blew out the candles before tucking herself into bed. The next morning she woke up bright and early, in time for Flitwick to post the names. Arjuna nodded politely to Flitwick and scanned the list. She smiled at the sight of her and Astoria's names on it. All right then, who is a threat? Arjuna thought to herself. Hannah Abbott. I hear she's pretty good. And so is Bridget Jahim. Her mother owns her own restaurant. A few other names on the list made her frown. Weasley's in the competition. Since when does he cook? Millicent Bulstrode. And Colin Creevy. How weird. Arjuna shrugged off her confusion. Well, Professor Ramsay wouldn't choose any slackers. If they can't keep up, they'll be weeded out quickly enough. She tossed her long black braid over her shoulder and headed back up the stairs toward the dorm with a satisfied smile. Even if she and Astoria were rivals, that didn't mean they couldn't talk about the competition. Chapter 12. Kevin. Chapter text. Kevin Whitby got to sleep very late the night after the audition. He'd been unable to get to sleep, as his brain had working at a mile a minute, so he kept himself busy with doing homework, playing with his toad Wallace, and finally writing a letter to his parents. He settled down in bed, drawing the curtains and lighting up his wand so he could see the parchment propped up on a thick book in his lap. Nibbling on the edge of his self-inking quill for a minute, he then slowly started to write. Hey, Mum and Dad, so I just had my audition today. Think I did all right. Professor Ramsay said my lemon ricotta biscuits were very tasty and tart, and he told me to tell Gran that he'd love to get her recipe. I figured that would make her happy. Kevin paused. He wondered for a moment if he should say that Ramsay also warned him about how soft the cookies were, but decided against it. His parents would only want to hear good news, no sense in worrying them. There are a lot of really great student cooks competing. In my group, I saw Malcolm Priest, who's one of our chasers, and these two Ravenclaw girls in my year, Astoria Greengrass and Arjuna Balaji, were also at the auditions. I've heard Arjuna has won blue ribbons for her cooking, so I'm sure she'll make it into the competition. Everything is fine here at Hogwarts. Hufflepuff is really looking forward to the Quidditch season coming back on. With our win against Ravenclaw in the fall, Hufflepuff is in the lead. I'm sure we'll win the Quidditch Cup for sure this year. Once again, Kevin decided not to mention that Hogsmeade trips were still cancelled thanks to what happened to Katie Bell. He just couldn't tell his parents about what had happened to her. He knew full well how scared they were about the war. They had to face the consequences of it every day, Mrs. Whitby hunting down Death Eaters with the rest of the Aurors, and Mr. Whitby protecting Muggles with his fellow police officers. The very last thing they needed was being scared for their son's sake. Weather's lovely up here. The snow is perfectly white and fluffy, just like the sort we used to see on holiday at our old cabin. It reminds me of the big fires we'd put in the fireplace, the mince pies we'd bake, and the ghost stories we'd tell at night. Back then it was fun to be scared, Kevin thought to himself. Memories of the three of them laughing and screaming together rippled over his mind. Back then, there wasn't really anything to be afraid of. No Death Eaters, no Dark Lord. No, danger. Plop. A big spot of ink landed on the parchment. It snapped Kevin back down to earth. He couldn't undo the mistake, so he simply ignored it. Miss you both so much. I'll try to get your birthday cake done a little early this year, Dad, so you can bring it into the office. How about a 3-layer German chocolate cake with caramel and almond shavings? Love from Kevin. Kevin finally dozed off in the wee hours of the morning. It wasn't until his best friends, Brendan Halkirk and Katsuji Yamazaki, burst into the room and ripped his bed curtains open that he shot awake. Kevin. Brendan hollered excitedly. Kevin, mate, you did it. You made it. Waha. Kevin was still half asleep. You made it into the top 12. Katsuji said more calmly, though his smile was just as big. Kevin rubbed his eyes. Top 12. What? Then his brain caught up. He bolted upright. I made it into the contest. Ah, yeah, laughed Brendan. Merlin only had to tell you 3 times for you to get it. Come on, get dressed and go look for yourself. Go on ahead, Kevin said quickly. I'll be right behind you. Brendan and Katsuji left the room and started up the stairs. Kevin snatched up his letter to his parents and scribbled a postscript in messy, oversized letters. P.S. I made it into the top 12. Wish me luck. Chapter 13. Millicent. Chapter text. Millicent Bulstrode slept in as long as she could the night after the auditions. Everyone's reactions to her auditioning had been negative enough that she figured it would be better to feign indifference if she made it in, rather than get excited. And she had a nagging feeling that she'd done pretty well. The look in Ramsay's eye when he'd first tasted her pistachio rose macarons had been enough to make her smile despite herself. Millicent honestly wasn't sure if this had been a good idea. She had a very definitive reputation at school, that of the tough girl, and that would definitely be jeopardized by her putting on a chef's apron. But everyone had been going on and on about Slytherin losing the House Cup because Draco dropped off the Quidditch team, and Millicent finally just got sick enough of it that she decided to try to earn those points back herself. It was definitely not because she actually liked cooking. She told everyone of course not. The night after the auditions, Millicent sat alone by the fire in the middle of the Slytherin common room, doing her defense against the dark arts homework. She ignored her doormates Daphne Greengrass, Pansy Parkinson, and Tracy Davis as they headed up to bed. At one point, a younger Slytherin boy from the auditions looked as if he was considering sitting by the fire too. But when he caught Millicent's eye and was victim to her cold, quietly aggressive stare, he quickly headed upstairs instead. She waited until the common room was completely deserted. Then in a hushed but very clear voice, she spoke into the empty room. "Winky, please come here." Crack! In an instant, a tiny house elf with long eyelashes, a mop of black hair, and very big watery eyes appeared in the slithering common room. "You called, Miss Millicent," squeaked the elf called Winky. Millicent's eyes softened significantly upon the elf. "Yes, I did," she said. "I wanted to thank you for your help at the audition today." Winky blinked in surprise. "Oh, but Miss Millicent," she squeaked. "Winky only did was what Master Gordon told her to do." "Yes, but you were still very helpful," Millicent replied patiently, "and I'm positive no one else thanked you lot for your good work, so thank you." Still faintly bemused, Winky nonetheless smiled slightly. "Oh, well, you're very welcome, Miss Millicent." Millicent didn't smile, per se, but her black eyes were quite soft. That was all. "I'll let you get back to work." Winky nodded, and with a new little bounce to her step, she disappeared with another crack. House elves were generally seen as second-class citizens in the wizarding world. They were almost exclusively servants of old wizard families, and frequently were given little respect in the eyes of the ministry. Although they were incredibly powerful magical beings, they were often treated as lesser creatures in comparison to wizards. Millicent had felt a lot of compassion for magical beings, that is, house elves, centaurs, werewolves, vampires, and hags for a long time. She'd even been largely raised by the Bulstrode family house elf, Lowry, since her parents were so often busy with their legal practice. After the First Wizarding War, they'd been very hard at work dealing with the aftermath, especially since so many of their friends had unsavory allegations swirling around them. That had resulted in Millicent largely raising herself, with help from Lowry the elf. Lowry was unusually spunky for an elf, and would covertly sidestep Mr. and Mrs. Bulstrode's strict rules to take Millicent to London and Diagon Alley while they were at work. When Millicent got to Hogwarts, she actively took an interest in house elf history, and that expanded into centaur culture and history upon meeting Professor Ferenza through divination class. She was sure to keep her liberal stance quiet around her parents, however, for they would definitely not take kindly to it. Even at Hogwarts, she tried not to make her stance common knowledge, since more than a few of her classmates' parents were friends with her parents, and Millicent had little interest in being the butt of anyone's jokes. Millicent put her finished homework and textbook away in her school bag, and then quickly headed up the stairs to bed. All of the other girls were sleeping, though Daphne was resting fitfully. Shuffling into bed, Millicent pulled the curtains shut and brought the covers over her so that her feet stuck out at the bottom. She tended to kick in her sleep, and having her feet constrained gave her bad dreams. When she woke up the next morning, Millicent went downstairs to find the common room bustling. Pansy Parkinson and Daphne Greengrass moved past her down the stairs. Tracy Davis, her other roommate, went over and greeted Daphne as Pansy darted off, presumably to look for Draco. Daphne looked at the board, her expression lightly smug as she headed back up toward their dorm. On her way, she gave Millicent a clipped nod. "Congratulations, Millicent," she said formally. Millicent tried to look offhand. "Made it then, did I?" "Yes," said Daphne. Her brown eyes ran over Millicent critically. "I'm surprised you went out for it." Millicent shrugged, not making eye contact with Daphne. Feeling more awkward than she would care to admit, she strolled quickly past Daphne to look at the board herself. There her name was, right between Bridget Jahim's and Daphne's. Looks like Potter's friend Weasley was competing too. And Hannah Abbott. This is going to be interesting, Millicent thought to herself dully. Very interesting. Chapter 14. Cho. Chapter text. Cho Chang slept intermittently the night after the audition, as per usual. She hadn't had a full night's sleep, where she hadn't had to wake up at least once in a very long time. Not since Cho had barely kept it together when she presented her cookies to Ramsay. She hadn't made her white chocolate-dipped ginger snap biscuits since Cedric was alive, and even just smelling them had brought all the memories back. Ramsay had been very kind when he tasted them, praising her on her flavors, and saying that he could tell her heart had really been in her biscuits, so that it helped somewhat. When Cho woke up the first time that night, it was because of her usual dream. She'd always be flying at the start. People would be flying around her as if she were in a Quidditch match, except no one's faces would be very clear, and she'd never see anyone actually carrying the quaffle or scoring goals. She'd be trying to catch the snitch, which was constantly just out of reach. Then, just as she was about to catch it, the snitch would be gone, and Cedric would be there in its place, reaching a hand out to her. And as soon as she'd grab his hand, that was always the worst part. In an instant, Cedric's smiling face would go pale and lifeless, his eyes staring blankly right through her and his shirt covered in dirt. He would look just like he had when Harry brought back his body. After you-know-who had murdered him, Cho would always try to pull away, but Cedric's grip tightened around her, and suddenly she'd be pulled downward, down, 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 with their brooms flying out of their hands, and the darkness inhaling them. Cho would always force herself awake before the acid-green dark mark appeared out of the black void and swallowed them both whole. If she'd stayed asleep long enough to see that, she would always invariably be shaking in uncontrollable terror when she woke up. Logically, Cho knew that people had gone through a lot worse than she had. Her ex-boyfriend Harry had actually seen Cedric die. She talked to Victor Crumb and Fleur Delacour after the tournament, and both of them had felt survivor's guilt, Crumb especially, as Barty Crouch Jr. had used the Imperious Curse on him to try to take out Harry's competition, Fleur and Cedric, so that only Harry would be taken the Triwizard Cup and gone to the graveyard. Part of me wishes that I'd been able to stun Cedric, too like I did with Fleur, Crumb had told her lowly. But then the other part of me is so relieved that Harry stopped me before I hurt him too. Both he and Fleur had nothing but nice things to say about Cedric. Fleur had even brought her arms around Cho to comfort her when she'd started to cry. Cho adjusted herself in bed, placing her hands under her head as she stared up at the top of her four-posted bed and at the sapphire blue hangings set up around it. She cried a lot in the year after Cedric's death. It was one of the main tension points between her and Harry before they broke up. Harry wanted to forget what had happened, and Cho didn't. Cedric meant enough to Cho that she couldn't just not know what had happened, even if the knowledge hurt. She had to know what had happened in order for it to be real. She had to know what had happened in order for her to heal. And she considered to herself, as she stared up at the top of her bed perhaps, she had not realized that because Harry already did know what had happened and was traumatized by it, he didn't really understand her needs as well as she'd thought he might, since he had been mourning Cedric like she was. And in retrospect, she really didn't blame him for that. After all, he'd only known Cedric for 2 years. She'd known Cedric almost her entire life. They'd met at a ministry Christmas function. They both were only children of ministry employees and had been dragged along by their parents, and being the only 2 children there, they had immediately run off to play. They snatched food from the potluck table and hid behind the long curtains draped around the enchanted windows, chatting about Quidditch for hours. From then on, play dates were scheduled, and young love blossomed. Cho, being the logical one of the 2 of them, had not called it love at the start. Even back then, she knew they were just children. Love was something adults did, so what they had had to be just a crush. But Cedric had known. He'd been wiser than her, even though she was in Ravenclaw and he was in Hufflepuff. So when he asked her on their first real date in her 3rd year, Cho had tried putting on the brakes. What if it ruined their friendship forever? Cedric had laughed that off effortlessly. Cho, you know me better than anyone in the world, he had said to her, grinning from ear to ear. Do you think you could ever bring yourself to hate me? And once she thought, she realized no. Nothing Cedric could ever do, nothing he would ever do, could ever make her stop caring about him. And she didn't even need to answer out loud, for Cedric knew her just as well as she knew him, and had already known what her response would be. So their romance began. It honestly wasn't much different from their friendship, except that Cedric was more open with his hugs, and they kissed on a regular basis. They still talked about Quidditch. They still talked about their goal to play on the same professional Quidditch team after school. They still played gobstones. Cedric still made Cho laugh with his corny jokes. Cho still cooked for him over the winter holidays. The only difference there was that when she was cooking, Cho would sometimes imagine cooking for Cedric in their own house, in their own kitchen, as husband and wife. By the time 6th year rolled around and Cedric entered the Triwizard competition, they'd been dating for 3 years. Cho had been hoping that after school, Cedric would formally propose to her. Maybe he'd even been planning to do so after winning the Triwizard tournament, she thought to herself. The prize money for that competition would have more than covered the price of a new house in Wandsworth Green, just like Cho had always dreamed. Cho turned over in bed, rubbing her eyes tiredly, and then reached under her bed. Her hand reached around for a minute before finding her sketchbook. She flipped through the pages until she found the one she was looking for. The prize money. That was this had all come down to. She had a chance to win this competition now, one that suited her talents. She knew Cedric would not have wanted her to pass it up, just as she hadn't wanted him to pass up the Triwizard tournament when he wanted to do it so badly. But there was no point in buying that house in Wandsworth Green anymore. Cho's old dream wouldn't be complete if she bought it now. All she wanted now was to make sure that no one forgot about Cedric. Her sketch was of a full, life-size statue of Cedric, with tiny writing written in cursive around the base. Remember Cedric Diggory. She'd originally sent a copy of her drawing to Mr. Diggory that Christmas, asking if he'd be all right with her wanting to commission one just like it to be placed at Hogwarts if she won the competition. The next day Mr. Diggory had sent back a letter soaked with tears. "There is no other home more deserving of such an honor," the letter had said. "I couldn't be more proud of you, and I know Cedric would be as well were he here." Cho ran her hand over her sketch, her black eyes dark with sorrow. Then she very gently put the sketchbook away and tried to fall back to sleep. Her next cluster of dreams she barely remembered when she woke up, but they were much more peaceful than any she'd had in a long time, and she could have sworn she'd heard Cedric's voice in most of them. When she woke up the second time, Cho decided to head downstairs to check the notice board. Her friend Marietta Edgecombe came with her. The terrible blisters Harry's friend Hermione Granger had cursed onto her face were still as insanely red as ever, but Cho barely saw them anymore. Her best friend's eyes and smile were infinitely more important. A crowd had already formed around the notice board. When some of them noticed Cho, they started cheering and chattering excitedly. "Congratulations, Cho," said her yearmate Eddie Carmichael. "You made it," Cho gawked. Marietta grabbed onto her friend's shoulder, shaking her excitedly. "I knew you'd make it," she said brightly. "Most of your competition's in Hufflepuff," said Carmichael smugly. "So you've got this in the bag. They might be pleasant chaps, but they don't know fine dining." "Eddie," Cho said in a cool, quelling tone, "kindly zip your lips so that I don't feel the urge to hex them shut." Carmichael took her at her word, leaving with his hands up by his head in half-hearted surrender. Marietta rolled her eyes, but turned to Cho with a fierce pride in her eyes. "That idiot is right about one thing. Cho, you've got this, no question." Cho smiled at her best friend, and for a moment she could almost imagine Cedric standing right behind Marietta, smiling just as proudly. Chapter 15. Carlin. Chapter text. Colin Creevey got to sleep on time the night after the audition, but woke up in the wee hours of the morning feeling wide awake, like a child anticipating Christmas morning. Feeling restless, Colin strolled down to the abandoned Gryffindor common room and found a spot in one of the comfy chairs set up in front of the fire. He stared into the flames, watching them lick at the darkened firewood and listening to their melodic crackles. It was too bad that he couldn't use the flu network to contact his dad. Sure, it was early, but Mr. Creevey's route as a milkman always got him up bright and early, so no doubt he'd already be awake. Sadly, Mr. Creevey was a muggle, so his house would not be linked to the flu network, and he'd probably have a heart attack seeing his son's disembodied head in the fireplace. Colin and his brother Dennis were both very close to their dad. How could they not be, when he was all the two boys had? Their mom had left the three of them when Dennis was just a baby. Colin barely remembered her now, but frankly, he didn't want to remember her, considering how badly she had hurt their dad. He tried dating again after she left, but Colin saw all of those relationships break off one by one, largely thanks to how much trouble his dad had trusting anyone with his heart again. It seemed sometimes like the only people Mr. Creevey trusted unconditionally were his sons. Colin looked out the window. He supposed he could always write his dad a letter and send it by owl post, but he'd had to keep them to a minimum, since the Creeveys lived in a very nosy neighborhood, and any owls that flocked around their house tended to draw a lot of unnecessary attention. And Colin and Dennis had brought their dad enough negative attention over the years, with their little outbursts of what they had not known at the time was magic. One time, Dennis had made an entire trail of flowers sprout up between him and the girl he had a crush on. Another time, when a bully had broken Colin's camera, Colin had accidentally transfigured a beehive that had been hanging in a tree overhead onto the bully's head, and he had been sent to the hospital with hundreds of bee stings covering his face. The two brothers even almost got expelled once when Colin accidentally hexed his brother's teacher after seeing her use corporal punishment on him in front of her class. He tried over and over to explain that he had only shouted at the teacher and not shoved her into the blackboard. He'd never even touched her, and even if he had, there was no way he'd be that strong. She'd been thrown into the blackboard with so much force that the blackboard had shattered into 100 pieces. Mr. Creevy had had no better explanation for all of the trouble his sons got into than they did, but he still loved them unconditionally. Many people over the years labeled his behavior as coddling, saying he had been protecting two delinquents who needed correction, but he refused to see it that way. Perhaps he'd been a bit starry-eyed about his two sons, Colin thought to himself, but he had been right. When Professor McGonagall arrived and explained what was really going on, it was the answer that all three of them had wanted to know for years. And after Colin received his Hogwarts letter and learned that he would be going to a school where he could learn to control his weird powers, Colin had made a promise to himself. From that day forward, Colin and Dennis would never embarrass Mr. Creevy again. Mr. Creevy would be proud of them and their accomplishments, and the Creevy name would earn esteem across this amazing new world they'd found themselves a part of, the wizarding world. And so during every holiday break, Colin showed his dad all of the pictures he took at school, the good, the bad, the embarrassing, and the funny, and told him about everything that he'd been unable to send a letter about. And every year, his dad would always say the same thing: everything was just so magical. Colin noticed a copy of the Daily Prophet abandoned on one of the side tables. He inched himself out of the armchair, snatched it up, and then sat back down, opening it up and reading the articles. Two more muggles found dead in Liverpool, Colin thought to himself grimly. It looks like the Death Eaters are travelling through the north of England. I wonder if you know who is trying to taunt Dumbledore by moving closer and closer to Hogwarts every month. Everyone knows he's more scared of Dumbledore than anyone. The thought made Colin's eyes narrow and his heart blaze with determination. Well, when I'm out of school, I'll join the Order of the Phoenix, and I'll make sure the Death Eaters never reach Hogwarts, he thought. If Hogwarts fell, well, then what would happen to all of the young Muggle-borns? Where would they be? Dennis and he had been able to start making something of themselves here at Hogwarts. Would those new Muggle-born students never find anywhere to go if Hogwarts didn't exist? Colin flipped through the rest of the paper. Finding the crossword, he put his hand on an abandoned quill on one of the tables and started to fill it out. He couldn't do anything until he was of age, naturally. Dumbledore wouldn't let him enlist at only 15. So in the meantime, all Colin could do was focus on the rest of his life as well as he was able. One of the clues was the head chef of Hell's Kitchen. That made Colin grin broadly as he scribbled in the answer. How proud would his dad be when he won the contest? How amazing would it be for his dad, meeting the best wizard chef in the country and visiting one of the best wizard-owned restaurants in the world? He could hear his dad now. Oh, it's just so magical. The sun rose several hours later. Colin had finished the crossword and started writing several letters to the Daily Prophet's editor regarding various articles. Some of the mistakes were simply grammar-oriented, but others, Merlin's beard. Colin wondered if anyone fact-checked things at the paper sometimes. Colin was the first one to see Professor McGonagall arrive in the common room with the list of names. He shot to his feet, staring at her avidly as she went over to the board to post it. "Did I make it?" he burst out before he could stop himself. McGonagall glanced at him a bit reproachfully, and Colin winced. She then stepped back and let him dart over to read the names. Colin found the Gryffindor heading, and there it was, his name, right above Ron Weasley's. "I took the liberty of sending your father a letter through the Muggle post," McGonagall said, and her lips curled up in a small, proud smile. "He should be receiving it in the next 2 days." Colin looked up at her, his eyes and smile overbright. "Thank you, Professor." McGonagall inclined her head in a small nod and swept out of the room. Chapter 16. Astoria. Chapter text Astoria Greengrass slept fitfully the night after the auditions. Regardless of how well the audition had gone, Astoria herself had not been pleased with the finished result. Cookies and sweets had never exactly been a strong point. She herself had always disliked very sugary foods and tended to gravitate toward more fruity or savory flavors. Even when she and her sister were little, Daphne's favorite sweet was chocolate frogs. Astoria's was Birdie Bart's every flavor beans. Still, Astoria had known she should try to appeal to what most people would prefer, so as to have a better certainty that she'd appeal to Ramsay's taste buds, and that would mean making a sugary biscuit. So instead of making a mince pie, like the sort she'd make for her Uncle Hyperion, or her personal favorite, cheesy thumbprint biscuits with tomato bourbon jam, she chose an extra hard recipe for vanilla and chocolate Napoleon-inspired biscuits. She'd picked it not just because of the sweeter flavors, but because Napoleons are one of the hardest desserts anyone can get right in their usual form, let alone as a biscuit. Alas, a half hour was precious time, and in the end, her biscuits had not turned out perfectly. Ramsay cited that they were too crispy around the edges and that the chocolate faintly overpowered the vanilla. He still seemed to enjoy them, but Astoria was put out. Despite his praise, she knew she could have done better. And if there was anything Astoria was, it was her own worst critic. When she returned back to the Ravenclaw common room that evening, she found an armchair by the window and settled down into it comfortably. Her friend Arjuna Balaji, who had been with her at the audition and had gotten great praise for her Nan Katai biscuits, headed up to bed first, and Astoria gave her a smile and a small wave as she left up the stairs. Astoria then took out her Muggle Studies homework and book from her bag and started writing her essay on Muggle transportation. Just as she was finishing up her paragraph about the London Tube, she suddenly became aware of a commotion just outside the Ravenclaw common room. It was loud enough that it got the attention of the other Ravenclaws studying in the room. It almost sounded like a fight, but no, there was too much cheering for that. The other students went to go check, and Astoria bustled after them, trying to make her way through the crowd. When they reached the entrance of the portrait hole and Astoria pushed her way to the front, she was horrified by what she saw. One of the Ravenclaw upperclassmen, a perfect prat of a 7th year named Eddie Carmichael, had strung a Slytherin first year up to one of the chandeliers by the back of his robes, and was now hexing those same robes to flash Ravenclaw colors like a light-up neon sign to the cheers of the entire crowd. The poor Slytherin boy looked terrified, but was trying desperately not to cry as he faced down his tormentors. The students who had come out of the common room with Astoria merely stood around looking baffled. Astoria, on the other hand, strode forward furiously, whipping her wand out in a single dramatic gesture. Expelliarmus! Eddie Carmichael's wand abruptly shot out of his hand and went soaring up into the air. The entire crowd watched the wand spiral around once in midair before landing in Astoria's outstretched hand. Astoria then barreled over to Carmichael, her light blue eyes flashing at him as she stood protectively in front of the first-year Slytherin boy. "What are you playing at?" she demanded. That kid was trying to sneak into Ravenclaw Tower," Carmichael explained, a little taken aback by her ferocity, but standing his ground. "He had this stuff with him." He held out a pot of Peruvian instant darkness power and a bottle of green spray paint. "It's going to vandalize the common room," Carmichael said, his hazel eyes flashing at the Slytherin boy behind Astoria in righteous fury. "I just figured we'd send him back to the snakes with some tagging of our own. Two wrongs do not make a right, Eddie Carmichael," Astoria snapped back. "Regardless of what he was trying to do, we are above bullying. Or at least, I frankly don't know or care how you sleep at night." Carmichael's eyes narrowed. "Chill out, Greengrass. We weren't hurting the kid." "You don't know the definition of hurt, then," Astoria said coldly. "It takes more than just physical wounds." She turned around to face the boy. His eyes were still full of tears he was trying desperately to choke back, and he stared at her in a watery mixture of confusion and disbelief. Astoria spared him a small, reassuring smile before levitating him off the chandelier and back down to the ground. She then disenchanted his clothes, removing the flashing Ravenclaw colors, and helped the boy pull his robes back on, since they'd partially come off in the mayhem. "I want you to go back to your common room," she told the boy quietly, her eyes gentle but her tone very stern. "And if someone dared you to do this, I want you to tell them that Astoria Greengrass says grow a backbone and do the stupid prank yourself." "Got it." The little Slytherin boy nodded silently. Then, his eyes still warily watching the other Ravenclaws, he dashed away as fast as he could. Astoria flashed one more menacing look at Carmichael before sweeping back into the common room to finish her homework. She wanted to finish all of the work she had for the week so far before the night was over, so she knew she had to get cracking. Astoria was something of an oddity in the house of Ravenclaw. Whereas many Ravenclaws thought with their heads primarily, Astoria was a rather emotional person. Was something she had in common with her sister Daphne, even though Daphne had always obscured it from the world at large, just as their parents did, and instructed them to do also. But Astoria, who had always been the black sheep of the family, disliked the Greengrass protocol demanding that they hide their intentions and feelings from the world. It seemed to her that in a world like the one they were in, people were often too stupid to look past the surface, and so it was prudent to make your emotions clear. That didn't mean one had to be completely open about everything, of course. Astoria certainly hid away any insecurities or fears she had, but she didn't feel the need to stand back and let people just take care of themselves. Uncle Hyperion certainly never felt the urge to do so. Hyperion Caro, who was one of Astoria's mother Thea's older brothers, was also a black sheep of the family. He'd been a Slytherin through and through, but he also had something of a rebellious streak. He loved taking risks and learning new things, and at Hogwarts had achieved the rare feat of earning 11 outstanding owls. So he had been a tutor for most of his nieces and nephews before they attended Hogwarts. Astoria adored her uncle. Her favorite time of every day had been when Hyperion would tutor her and Daphne, teaching them the history behind the creation of Hogwarts, instructing them on the proper way to hold one's wand so that it would be harder for someone to disarm you, and showing them how to collect frog spawn in nearby ponds. In retrospect, Astoria thought to herself that it was likely thanks to Uncle Hyperion that she'd grown such a love for books and study, and that love of academics placed her where she was now, rather than in Slytherin House with Daphne. Daphne, her older sister, had always taken more after their parents. When Astoria had popped out a Ravenclaw, Daphne had quickly withdrawn from her sister, just as her parents had. Astoria knew that it was likely Daphne thought she had to follow the self-absorbed principles their parents had taught them and simply look after herself. But that didn't mean the rejection hadn't hurt. The last few years had been very hard for Astoria at home, so much so that she'd actively tried to stay at Hogwarts as much as she possibly could. She just couldn't deal with slinking around like a stray cat, trying not to listen as their parents discussed the state of the war with a measure of satisfaction rather than fear or horror. Astoria could see which way the wind was blowing. Things were getting worse, so she knew she had to get out of her parents' house as soon as possible. When the hurricane arrived, she knew staying in that house would be tantamount to condemning herself to a life in Azkaban, locked in a home that would no doubt be a gathering place for Death Eaters and pureblood supremacists. And that was something Astoria's soft, noble heart could not stand the thought of. It would be difficult living on her own at 14, but she knew deep down there was no other option. And she could always contact Professor McGonagall and ask to access the funds set up for impoverished students for her school supplies, so she could be prepared for her owls next year. She'd have to get top marks to become a healer, after all. When Astoria finished her homework a few hours later, she trudged up to bed and tried to will herself to sleep, even though her brain was working at a mile a minute. 5,000 galleons. A tenth of that would cover the down payment on an apartment, and then the rest could likely cover her rent for the next 8 months, maybe a year, if she took a part-time job over the summer. And if she applied for some ministry scholarships, then she'd probably be able to stretch that to about 2 years, maybe even until she was legal age, and could get a better paying job, maybe at St. Mungo's. Even when she did fall asleep, these thoughts kept whirling in her head and prevented her from sleeping peacefully. When she woke up the next morning, she showered, brushed her hair, and slipped on her robes in under 10 minutes. Just as she was getting ready to head downstairs, Arjuna came upstairs to meet her. She came up behind her, squeezing her in a hug from behind. Guess what? Arjuna said in a sing-song voice, her smile broad and toothy. Someone made it into the contest with me. Astoria gave her friend's reflection in the mirror a sardonic smile. Was it Eddie Carmichael? She asked innocently. Arjuna stuck her tongue out at Astoria. No, it's you, silly, Astoria chuckled quietly. I know, I know. Then the information fully kicked in. She turned to look at Arjuna, her mouth spreading into a wide smile. So we both made it. Yep, Arjuna said brightly. You, me, and Cho Chang for Ravenclaw, though with all due respect to her, I don't think she'll be much competition. Being good at flying and good at cooking don't have to be mutually exclusive things. RJ, Astoria said warningly. RJ was Astoria's nickname for Arjuna. She'd always nicknamed her friends, ever since she was little. Daphne had been Fiffy, way back when. Just in your case, then, teased Arjuna. Astoria gave Arjuna a pointed shove, and Arjuna laughed. Astoria was notoriously awful at flying. She hated heights, and in first year the broom had refused to jump up into her hand, no matter how hard she tried. When she actually tried getting into the air, she had flown around in chaotic spirals and had been taken to the hospital wing after her head collided with a tree branch, and she was knocked unconscious. Arjuna looped her arm around Astoria's, yanking her down the stairs. Come on, I have some recipes I want to run by you, and I want to know what you're thinking too. I promise I won't steal any of your ideas. Astoria smirked. If you did, you'd only help me show off that I can do it better. In your dreams. Chapter 17. Owen. Chapter text. Owen slept like a rock the night after the auditions. Once he was asleep, there was never anything in the wide world that could ever wake him. His doormates liked to joke that even an earthquake wouldn't be enough to stir Owen out of a sound sleep. Admittedly, Owen's audition had gone rather well, as far as he was concerned. Sure, his Alpha Jaws biscuits with dulce de leche may not have been as pretty as a lot of his competition, but Ramsay had enjoyed his flavors and had been impressed by his knowledge of South American recipes. Owen had originally thought of making his grandmother's oatmeal raisin, but after thinking it over, he decided that for a competition like this, he'd have to either go big or go home. So he'd rustled through the old compendium of recipes his dad had put together when he was in the Navy traveling overseas, and settled on the caramel sandwich biscuits from Argentina that his dad had called Alpha Jaws. Owen had always been a rather laid-back kid with a love of creature comforts, but when he wanted something, he was always the sort to put in the work needed to come out ahead of his competition. Back home in the magical community of Salazar's Grove, he'd been a hippogriff scout from the time he was 4 years old, going camping in magical forests and capturing billywigs so that the troop could make their own handmade fizzing whizbees out of their stingers and freshly churned ice cream. His hippogriff scout troop had been a second family for him while his mother was working at the office during the day, and Owen had always loved bringing all of the fun things he'd learned home to her every afternoon when she got home, and they and Owen's grandmother, Grandma Trudy, all made dinner together. Nowadays, Owen had an eye on slightly more adventurous pursuits. When he'd heard about the Magic F contest, his mind raced with the possibility not only would there be so many delicious things he, his mom, and his grandmother could try together at Hell's Kitchen, but with the prize money, the three of them could travel all over, sampling all sorts of multicultural cuisine. They could try all the amazing food his dad had wrote about and see all the amazing things he'd seen. Owen knew how much that would mean to his mom, and it'd mean an awful lot to him, too. Owen said goodnight to his upperclassmen friends from the Gobstones Club, Tamsin Appleby, Gregory Munslow, and Malcolm Preece, in the common room, and then to his best friend, Elena Bradstone, at the stairs separating the girls' and boys' dorms. He then tucked himself into bed, smiling widely. He knew today had gone well. Soon, maybe, he'd be in the contest, and he could get to work getting that money for that amazing world tour he'd always dreamed about. First, we'll go to Paris, France, he thought firmly. The chef's capital of the world. We'll tour the Louvre and Notre Dame, and of course stop by the Paris Opera House for a live show, before stopping by for a meal at the Cockatrice Cellier hidden underneath it. Next, Italy. We'll visit the La Befana monument outside the Sicilian ministry, visit the canals, and try fresh pasta at the best restaurants in town. We'll have to get an enchanted Venetian mask to bring home too, for Grandma to hang in her room. Next Greece, and then a train into Istanbul. We can explore the bazaars of Genoa and buy dragon fangs that never lose their fire breath shine. Then we can take a bus into the heart of Africa and search for wild erumpents in the Nigerian savannah. Oh, right, and Egypt. We can explore the cursed ruins of Luxor with a real curse breaker, and maybe we'll see a real sphinx. Then I'll be able to solve one of its riddles. If I can, and if I can't, I'll have to run for my life. Merlin, that'll be a story to tell. Then we can ride a magic carpet across the Middle East, into Saudi Arabia and through India. We can see the Taj Mahal and meet Dev Karman, the youngest professional seeker in the world. We'll have to make sure we try all of the best restaurants too. Maybe we can even visit a hookah lounge. And Japan. Oh man, we could spend weeks there, hunting down kappas and exploring old shrines, and imagine all the fresh seafood, all the amazing sushi, and the cherry blossoms. And then Australia. We can visit the Opera House and go to the Australian Ministry's headquarters in the Nullarbor Plain. I wonder if any of the officers positioned in Sydney would still remember Dad. The United States, we'd probably have to spend at least a week on New York City, and Los Angeles alone would probably take 2 days each. And Salem, we could probably take 3, with all of their witch-hunting history, and we could search for thunderbirds in the Midwestern plains. His thoughts went on and on like this. The 13-year-old was way too deep in his dreaming to even consider that there was no way he could pay for everything he'd thought of doing with 5,000 galleons. But the possibility alone was thrilling. The doors that such a prize opened made Owen's heart race. When Owen woke up the next morning, he leapt out of bed and dashed upstairs to go check the schedule. On his way up, he ran right into a tiny girl with brown hair dashing out from the second-year girls' dorm. "Ow," said Owen. "Watch where you're going." The girl, however, had barely stopped. Still running down, she merely shot a bemused look back at him. "I am," she said coolly, showing off the gaps between her teeth when she spoke. "Maybe if you were watching where I was going too, you wouldn't have run into me." Owen stared after her, shaking his head once in bewilderment. Then, grumbling to himself about how weird girls were, he ran up the rest of the stairs. When he came up, all of the Hufflepuffs were gathered around the notice board, talking to each other excitedly. Owen saw the obnoxious second-year girl reach the board, and upon reading it, she screamed, "I made it! I made it!" A few of the upperclassmen, including the sixth-year prefect Ernie Macmillan, congratulated the small girl. His heart beating with anticipation, Owen bustled forward so he could look at the board himself. As he read the names, he suddenly became aware of someone standing just over him reading the board too. The person must have seen his name as soon as he did, for as soon as Owen's face burst out into a huge grin at the sight of it, the person hugged him from behind, squeezing him tight. "Owen, you made it," said a voice Owen recognized as Tamsin. "Good on you, Owen," said Malcolm, who put forward a bit of a sad smile. "Wish I'd made it too." Owen grinned at the two of them and Gregory, who was also smiling proudly. "Thanks, you guys." Owen noticed Alina coming up the stairs. She caught his eye, looking almost questioningly. He beamed from ear to ear at her, putting both thumbs in the air, and her expression lit up. She dashed over, pushing through the crowd, and gave him a big hug. "Congratulations, Owen," she said, and for once her quiet voice was shaking with a measure of excitable volume. "Oh, your mum is going to be so proud of you." Owen's black eyes softened. "Yeah," his eyes then lit up with a thought. "You reckon I could send her a howler just so she can hear how excited I am?" Alina gave him a reproachful smile. "Receiving a howler would probably scare your mother half to death," she said levelly, her voice returning to its usual restrained pitch. "I think a letter will do quite nicely." Okay, laughed Owen. Chapter 18. Rose. Chapter text: Rose Zeller stayed up all night like a sugar-high child, which, honestly, she was. Her audition had gone so well that she'd eaten 4 whole fizzing Whizbees afterwards. Rose had taken a gamble with her entry. She'd seen these stained glass biscuits in a Christmas catalogue at the supermarket over the holidays and spontaneously decided that she wanted to try making them all by herself for the very first time at the audition. She used stencils to cut star shapes out of her round sugar biscuits and then poured a boiling hot sugar, water, corn syrup, orange extract, and food coloring mixture in each of the cutouts. To her excitement, when the biscuits were done cooking, they turned out perfectly, with the colorful center hardening like rock candy in the center of her soft, sweet sugar biscuits. When Ramsay first bit into it, he chewed it slowly, giving Rose the longest look. "Remind everyone, darling," he had said, "how old you are. 15, 14. Rose had grinned from ear to ear. 12, sir. Absolutely brilliant. Those words echoed in Rose's head all day afterwards. She even crowed it a few times to herself, just to help it sink in. Absolutely brilliant, she cheered, disregarding the confused looks she was attracting. Absolutely brilliant. Rose immediately wrote a letter to her mom and stepdad back home in Bristol with a collection of multicolored gel pens she'd smuggled in. She always preferred writing with different colors, and as much as school had forced her to write with a quill during class, she still preferred writing with pens. It was just what she was used to, even though her stepfather, George, was a wizard. She'd been largely raised in the Muggle world, and so knew it best. Her mother, Catherine, and George Ketteridge had met quite by chance. Rose had unknowingly cast magic when she and Catherine were out shopping, and had made every cookie box on the shelves levitate up toward the ceiling. George had initiated a conversation with Catherine when the strange incident was over, and the next week they went on their first date. They'd been dating for almost 2 years when Rose got her letter to Hogwarts, and George revealed to Catherine that he, in fact, was a wizard too. He actually was one of the Ministry employees who had modified some of the memories of the Muggles who witnessed Rose's outburst. George said he'd merely wanted to make sure that Rose and Catherine were all right, since the magical episode had left Catherine shaken and confused. But before he knew it, he'd fallen hard and fast for Catherine and never looked back. George taught Rose and her mother everything he could about the wizarding world. He brought them to the Ministry, introduced them to all of his co-workers in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, gave them an in-depth tour of Diagon Alley, and taught Rose how to use the Flu network both to travel and to communicate. It seemed to Rose that George had been both thrilled and relieved to share his world with them, like having to hide everything he was from them had been burdening him for years, and he was so happy to finally share his secret with them. Rose sort of knew how he felt. Whenever she visited her father, Patrick Zeller, it was hard not to tell him about what was going on at Hogwarts. Patrick Zeller was still on moderately good terms with his estranged wife and daughter, considering that his stint in prison for burglary was the main reason why they were no longer a family. At the beginning, he had known about Rose's magic, as per the Ministry bylaws demanding that all immediate family members know of a child's magic once they turn 11. But not long afterward, Patrick had tried gabbing about the wizarding world to his friends, and had even tried to prove the existence of Diagon Alley to one of his girlfriends. After that, George and a few of his co-workers were sent to deal with the issue and correct the memories of the Muggles Patrick had spoken to. It had also been decided by Minister Fudge that Patrick Zeller was just too big of a liability, and had put down the decision that his memory was to be wiped of all knowledge of his daughter's magical talents. Patrick had been inconsolable throughout the entire ordeal at the thought of forgetting all of the beautiful, magical things he had seen, but he accepted the decision all the same. Despite everything he'd done, Rose bore no ill will toward her father. She was sharp enough and kind enough to see that despite his criminal record and his inability to keep his mouth shut, there was still a lot of good in Patrick Zeller. He still was the funniest, most amiable man she knew. He still carried a picture of Rose as a baby in his wallet and showed it to everyone he met with pride. He still baked Christmas cookies for his co-workers every year. He still, without fail, sent Rose a new cookbook every Christmas, even when he'd had to work triple overtime just to afford it. And even though Catherine didn't speak to Patrick much anymore, she never spoke ill of her ex-husband in front of Rose, and she supported Rose's decision to keep his surname, even when she'd taken George's. Rose spent all night writing her mother and George's letter in multicolored ink, before working on a similar but faintly edited copy for her father. Then she put both in small pink envelopes decorated with blue, green, and purple calligraphy, and put them on her bedside table so she could send them in the morning. Then, to keep her mind busy waiting for the sun to rise, she started doodling cacti and robots in the spiral notebook she'd brought. She would never understand why wizards didn't use notebooks. It was so much easier to keep notes in, rather than try to paperclip a whole bunch of loose pieces of parchment together or put them in folders. Her white kitten, Mr. Whiskers, cuddled up in her lap as she doodled, falling asleep on her leg even though his owner was still wide awake. When it was finally a suitable enough time, Rose scooped Mr. Whiskers off of her lap, jumped out of bed, and dashed up the stairs, her sole focus on getting to the common room to see the notice board. On the way, she collided with a dark-skinned boy from the third-year boys' dorm who was also making his way up the stairs. "Ow," he said. "Watch where you're going." Undeterred, Rose kept running, shooting the boy a frown over her shoulder as she went. "I am," she said coolly. "Maybe if you were watching where I was going too, you wouldn't have run into me." Rose reached the landing at the top of the stairs and practically jaunted over to the notice board, where many other Hufflepuffs were gathered. She squeezed through the crowd to get to the front and found the list of names, and at the very top, her blue eyes widened and her mouth spread into the hugest grin. "I made it," she screamed at the top of her lungs. "I made it." A batch of the Hufflepuffs around her burst into applause. One of the upperclassmen prefects patted Rose on the shoulder. "Well done," he said in slightly inflated, but still perfectly genuine pride. "Thanks," Rose chirped brightly. She bounced around the room as if her feet were on springs, right past the dark-skinned third-year boy and back down the stairs. She had to add on to her letters and then get them to the owlery right away. Chapter 19. Bridget. Chapter text. Bridget Jahim slept very well the night after the auditions. Her biscuits had turned out just the way she'd hoped, and Ramsay's reaction to them had been pretty close to how she'd hoped too. Bridget resisted the urge to write to her mother that very night with some difficulty. Ms. Jahim had always been Bridget's very best friend and confidant, but Bridget wanted to know the results of her audition for sure before sending her any letters. So in the meantime, Bridget merely skimmed through her old box of recipes, contemplating which ones she might be able to use in the competition. Knowing Ramsay, he's probably going to try to stretch us by giving us different sorts of foods every round, she thought to herself. That way he can get the full breadth of our talents. Her black eyes rested on a recipe for potato soup with bacon and asparagus thoughtfully. Might be good for a soup challenge, she mused, or perhaps for a savory round. This potato soup recipe always brought the people into lattes in the chilly days of early spring. From the time Bridget was little, she remembered her mother making that soup in her restaurant kitchen herself, while the rest of the kitchen staff worked on the rest of the orders, so as to keep their guests from waiting too long. And the food would always be nice and piping hot when it arrived at the guests' tables. Lattes had always been stretching to make ends meet. Because the restaurant was so small, they could only bring in a certain number of customers at a time, and because they could only serve so many customers, Charlotte Jahim had trouble covering the space rental with her earnings. The logical solution would have been to drive up prices, but Ms. Jahim was much too sharp for that. "Our regulars are working-class people who want quickly prepared, but savory food," she once remarked to Bridget. "If we make the prices too high, then no one will come." So Ms. Jahim pinched her pennies, and she and Bridget made do with what they had. From time to time, they would find windows perfectly washed before any of their employees had even arrived, or dishes that had been shattered would suddenly be completely fixed when they turned around. Back then, of course, neither of them considered that it might be been Bridget, or that it might be been magic. When Bridget was accepted into Hogwarts, it actually took a load off of Ms. Jahim for some of the year. There was a school fund set up for impoverished students, so Bridget could get all of the school supplies she needed even if they were second-hand. And while she was at school, Bridget got everything she needed to eat. So Ms. Jahim had a little bit extra every year to give her employees bonuses or send Bridget little gifts. Bridget's favorite gifts from her mother, however, even after all these years, were the dishes she'd cook, bundle up, and send to her. In Bridget's first year, Ms. Jahim had even made an entire green bean casserole and had 3 owls deliver it to her daughter at Hogwarts Christmas morning. Bridget flipped through her recipes, smiling at each one. Pasta primavera, that'd probably be good for a pasta round, mushroom slow-cooked roast beef, that'd probably be good for a roast round, or maybe a comfort food round, black-eyed pea fritters, maybe for a round using legumes. She shook her head with a smile. As she came to the end of her recipes, she found the picture she always kept at the very back of the stack. The picture was of her, around the age of 7, and her mother. Bridget was dressed in a violet tutu, a horned headband, a black, red, and violet cape, and black ballet shoes, and she was grinning from ear to ear despite her 2 missing front teeth. Miss Jahim had both of her arms wrapped around her daughter and looked as proud as if Bridget had been the prima in the English National Ballet. Bridget loved ballet. She'd started when she was 3, and she'd intimidated most of her classmates with her confidence and level of talent. Because of her supreme confidence, Bridget had often been cast as the villains in their school productions, as evident by the picture where she'd been dressed as the evil fairy Caraboss. That had never discouraged Bridget, though playing the bad guy in the shows was fun. They were so theatrical and over the top. And besides, it was only pretend. She knew she was really a good person, after all. It had broken her heart to stop dancing. But not only had ballet classes become much less affordable for her mother, but with her attending Hogwarts over the fall and spring, there was no way Bridget would be able to keep up with ballet classes over the summer holidays alone and expect to keep up. And so Bridget had had to bow to the circumstances at hand and stop taking classes. She tried very hard not to show too much of her disappointment to her mother, but it had still hurt. Still, Bridget had cooking, and she had magic. Defense against the dark arts and potions. Bridget loved those classes too, and she was certainly glad that she wouldn't have to give those up. Bridget smiled at the picture of herself and her mother together for a long moment. Her mother would be proud like that again if she won Ramsay's competition. And for the first time, Lottie's would actually be ahead of the game financially, rather than having to scrape and cut back. Putting the box away in her nightstand, Bridget turned over in bed and fell asleep, her lips still touched with a smile. The next morning, Bridget came downstairs to find the Slytherin common room full of activity. When she arrived, her classmates started to applaud politely. Bridget looked around at them, faintly bemused. What's everyone clapping for?" she asked, smiling despite her discomfort. The fifth-year Slytherin prefect laughed. "They're clapping because you made it into the contest, smart one," he teased. "Nice going." Bridget was startled. She looked around at the other people in the common room. There were a few students, the ones who fancied themselves to be blood purists, who were notably silent, but the vast majority of Slytherin students were smiling and praising her, clapping, patting her on the back, and complimenting her success. Even in this time, when he, who must not be named, was so powerful, Slytherin House applauded the success of a Muggle-born student. Bridget's lips spread into a broad, triumphant, but still excited grin. "Thanks, guys," she said loud enough for everyone to hear her. "I swear to you, I'll do everything I can to get Slytherin the win. I promise, Mum," she added to herself as everyone burst into applause again. "I'll win for you." Chapter 20. The Chefs Assemble. Chapter text. Everyone in school waited with bated breath for January 10th, the date for the first round of Magicef Junior, to arrive, none more so than the 12 contestants. Harry had never seen Ron in the library so much in his life, not even back in 3rd year when he was helping Hagrid with Buckbeak's appeal. "Well, we have no idea what Ramsay's going to have us do in the first round," Ron explained anxiously to Harry as he put down a stack of heavy magical cookbooks on the table. "So I've got to read up as much as I can ahead of time." The Magicef round was held in the Quidditch pitch. It was the only place large enough to house all of the students who wanted to watch it. Ron had had to meet Ramsay with the other competitors early in the dungeons, so Harry and Hermione wished him the best of luck before he left that morning, while they headed off to Charm's class. It had been very strange for Harry, not having Ron sitting next to him during class. Harry and Ron had always taken all of their classes together, even divination, which was the only class Hermione had ever dropped out of. When Harry and Hermione arrived in the Quidditch pitch at 4:00 that evening, after classes were over, they found it as transformed as Ramsay's potions classroom had been. There were 12 expansive kitchen workspaces, lined up in 4 rows of 3, and each was decorated with the school colors of the competitor the station belonged to. The 4 houses' colors also decorated the stands, and the pillars surrounding the stadium had magically appearing text and pictures dancing across them. At that moment, the words Magicef Junior, Round 1, were being spelled out letter by letter, and then the Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw and Slytherin crests flashed across the banners one at a time, to the applause of each house in turn. On every seat in the bleachers was a free pair of omnioculars like the one Harry had back in his trunk in the Gryffindor common room. Harry and Hermione found seats next to Ginny, who had decided to sit at the cross-section between the Gryffindor and Ravenclaw stands so she could sit by Luna Lovegood. Luna was looking as odd as ever, wearing earrings that looked like they'd been made out of a bunch of bottle caps that had been strung together. "Hey, Luna," greeted Harry. "Hello, Harry," she said dreamily. "I brought some caramelized toadstools for a snack. Would you like one?" She offered a box of what vaguely looked like mushrooms, except they were blackened and as limp as chewed bubble gum. "No, thanks," Harry said offhandedly. Ginny looked at Harry, her lips twitching with some nerves. "How's Ron doing?" "All right, I think," Harry answered. "Ron's going to have a hard time of it," Luna said vaguely. Arjuna Balaji apparently won 3 blue ribbons for her cooking by the time she was 10, and Cho's cakes are quite good. Hermione glanced at Harry uncomfortably. "That's right, Cho's in the competition too, I'd forgotten." Harry had forgotten too. He'd been so excited for Ron that he'd barely given the other competitors much thought. Even when Colin Creevey came up to them to excitedly tell them he'd made it and to wish Ron the best of luck, Harry's focus had still not widened that much beyond Ron, given how much he wanted to encourage him. Ginny frowned deeply, her eyes darting from Harry to Luna. "Ron'll kick Cho's ass. You just wait and see." After about 15 minutes in which everyone found their seats, 4 figures started striding up the lawn. In the lead was Ramsay. Just behind him were Dumbledore and 2 others Harry didn't recognize. The first was a tall, older woman with full lips, dark skin, and a mane of curly black-brown hair, dressed in ridiculously bright orange dress robes. The second was a man who, at first glance, rather resembled a walrus, with a silver handlebar mustache and a very short, portly frame that he decked out in emerald green velvet robes, complete with a brown houndstooth waistcoat with gold buttons. Hermione grabbed Harry's arm. "That woman is Millicent Bagnold," she hissed in his ear. She was the Minister of Magic before Fudge. Now that Hermione said it, Harry realized he had heard the name before, in one of Dumbledore's memories in the Pensive. She'd been the minister who'd been in charge during the First Wizarding War and who had overseen the prosecution of most of Voldemort's followers after it. She'd been the one who sent Sirius to Azkaban. The thought left a sour taste in Harry's mouth. Ramsay faced the crowd. Taking out his silver-tipped wand, he placed it up against his mouth and magically magnified his voice with the spell Sonorous. "Good evening, one and all," he greeted. "Welcome to the first round of the very first Magic Junior competition, hosted here at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." Harry noticed several white flashes coming from the teacher's box. When he glanced over, he noticed a rather excitable-looking woman with very curly blue-dyed hair put up in a high ponytail snapping away. Her pink cat's eyeglasses reminded him irritably of Rita Skeeter. Guess she must be from the Daily Prophet, he supposed. He wondered if Ramsay's reputation alone had earned this event press coverage, or if Ramsay had actively sought it out. Either way, he seemed all too comfortable in front of the cameras. "Firstly, let me introduce the 4 judges for this competition," said Ramsay. "In essence of fairness, each house will be represented by a judge who is an alumnus of that house. First off, we have your school headmaster, Albus Dumbledore." He indicated Dumbledore with none of the distrust he usually showed. "Representing the noble house of Gryffindor." The Gryffindors all screamed and applauded. Dumbledore waved airily at the crowd with his good hand, his elderly face crinkled up with the tiniest traces of a smile. "Next, we have an alumnus of the Hogwarts staff, who taught the art of potions for almost 30 years, and who singularly funded the renovation and expansion of the Hogwarts kitchens out of his own pocket, Horace Slughorn, representing the peerless house of Slytherin. Ramsay mentioned him when I first met him," Harry whispered to Hermione as the walrus-mustached man waved at the applauding and cheering Slytherins in the stands. "He said Slughorn was his teacher, back at school." Third, we have a former Minister of Magic who, in retirement, has written almost 15 books, including 8 wonderful cookbooks, Millicent Bagnold, representing the brilliant house of Ravenclaw. The Ravenclaw stands burst into applause even before Ramsay had finished speaking. Bagnold gave them a dewy smile and a wave that Harry thought came across as awfully staged, like she'd done that exact same wave 1,000 times, so as to make sure she looked flawless in any pictures that might be taken of her. "And finally, you've got me," said Ramsay, his mouth spreading into a large grin as his voice rose to a triumphant shout himself, representing the best of the entire lot, the House of Hufflepuff. The Hufflepuff side of the stands erupted in whooping, clapping, and stomping, so much so that even when some members from the other houses tried booing, all anyone could really hear was Hufflepuff's happiness. Bagnold, her lips twitching with a daring smile, used her own wand to magnify her voice too. "Oh, now, Gordon," she proclaimed to the stands in a tone that once again sounded rehearsed to Harry's ears. "Don't go riling up the children with house pride. The best competitor shall be the victor, regardless of house." Her voice rose amusedly. "And we all know Ravenclaw has the sharpest and most creative minds of them all." The Ravenclaw stands echoed her with more applause. Slughorn, with a chuckle, stepped forward, bringing his own wand to his mouth to magnify his voice too. "Mind the ego, Millie, my dear," he said jovially. "After all, brilliance and creativity are only two things we'll be judging today. A good chef also needs resourcefulness and the ability to take risks, something Slytherin House has in spades." He finished, his voice having risen to a perfect bellow. The Slytherin stands screamed and cheered. When Dumbledore stepped forward, resting his own wand on the top of his white beard to magnify his voice, everyone was on the edge of their seat to hear his response. The other judges turned to look at him too. Dumbledore looked around, smiling pleasantly at them all. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. "Gryffindor." The one word hung in the air for 1, 2, 3 seconds, and then Dumbledore lowered his wand, clearly thinking he didn't need to say anything else. Harry was the first one to start laughing, and the laughter that overtook Gryffindor's side of the stands quickly evolved into a huge roar of applause. Dumbledore smiled wryly at the other judges, who shot him faintly frustrated but still amused looks. "And now we'll introduce our 12 competitors," said Ramsay. "From my house of Hufflepuff, I give to you Rose Zeller, Owen Caldwell, Kevin Whitby, and Hannah Abbott." The 4 Hufflepuffs dashed out from the left-hand side of the pitch, skipping across the green over to their stations one by one, to the applause of their house. Rose, who had been twirling and dancing the whole way, made it to her station first, while Owen took his time, waving around at everyone in the crowd as he strolled leisurely to his station. "From Ravenclaw," said Bagnold, "I am pleased to introduce Arjuna Balaji, Astoria Greengrass, and Cho Chang." The 3 Ravenclaw girls came out from the right side of the pitch, waving at the cheering crowd as they walked quickly to their stations. Of the 3, Astoria looked the least comfortable, Cho looked perfectly at ease in front of the crowd, and even Arjuna smiled politely and waved quite gracefully. But Astoria seemed to be waving more out of expectation than out of any particular excitement. "From Slytherin," said Slughorn, "I proudly present Bridget Jahim, Millicent Bulstrode, and Daphne Greengrass." The 3 Slytherin girls strode out from the back of the pitch, all looking effortlessly confident as they marched to their stations in a straight, military-like line to the hollers and cheers of their housemates. Bridget even flashed a white smile and blew a kiss to the stands. Dumbledore raised his wand to his mouth again. "And finally, from Gryffindor House I call forward Colin Creevey and Ron Weasley." Colin and Ron darted out from under the stands and up the field. Colin turned as he walked, waving at his friends in the stands, but Ron didn't turn back once, instead just barreling right to his station, even as the Gryffindors burst into deafening cheers. Harry recognized the stiffness in his friend's posture, and he felt his blood run cold. "He looks anxious," Hermione whispered, and she sounded just as concerned. Harry knew it was much worse. Ron had gone this way before Quidditch matches before. He would think that he couldn't do it, and then he would just stew in those thoughts longer and longer until his mind went blank and he forgot absolutely everything. Ginny, noticing the concern on both of their faces, turned to watch her brother in the stands apprehensively. "Come on, Ron," she murmured under her breath. "Don't blow it. These are your top 12 best student chefs, Hogwarts," proclaimed Ramsay. In this competition, they will have to use both their baking and magical talents to try to get to the top of the heap in this competition, and the prize of 5,000 galleons, 200 points for their house, a free reservation for their family at Hell's Kitchen, and the title of the very first Magic Junior. The crowd applauded and cheered. Hermione turned to Harry and Ginny confusedly. Magical talent, she repeated, confused, as Ramsay kept speaking to the crowd. I didn't know they'd be allowed to use magic in the competition. Well, sure, said Ginny. A lot of witches and wizards use magic in their cooking to mix ingredients and help things cook a certain way. Mum tends to see it sort of like cheating, but she's been known to levitate things out of the oven when she's got a lot to do. With how restrictive their timetables are going to be, I'm willing to bet they'll have to use magic to stay ahead. Seems to me that puts the younger students at a disadvantage, Hermione said with a frown. And Ron, too, pointed out Luna, her vague tone punctuated by grimness. Did your mother teach him how to use magic while he was cooking, Ginny? Ginny blinked, not having considered this. I don't know, she said slowly, her brown eyes growing very concerned. I think she was more focused on him learning about flavors and textures and stuff like that. I mean, Ron had never cooked on his own before, so he had a lot to catch up on. She glanced at the others. Harry, Hermione, do you remember her mentioning magic to him? I don't think so, Hermione replied meekly. She looked at Ron in the stands, her gloved fists resting over her mouth anxiously. Oh, Ron, no wonder he's nervous. Here to support you in your challenges, said Ramsay, are your house elf partners, who each chose to be your resource and help you during your time in the competition. Colin, said Dumbledore, you were selected by Quabai, who, if I may say, is easily the fastest at making a delicious hot chocolate of any elf I have ever met. A house elf with big blue eyes appeared on top of Colin's station. The Gryffindor boy amiably offered Quabai a handshake, which startled the elf, but he obliged. And Ron, I do believe you'll be very happy with your partner during this competition, Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eye. Darby the house elf, still dressed in his earless red cap and decked out in the mismatched Christmas socks he'd gotten from Harry last year, appeared at Ron's station. He immediately grabbed both of Ron's hands and shook them gleefully. Oh, Darby got to be Ron's partner, whispered Hermione, delighted. That's wonderful. Rose, said Ramsay with a smile, you were chosen by Tip, who I think is the only elf who can keep up with your level of energy. Owen, your partner is Jolie, a risk-taker with flavors just like you are. Kevin, you'll be working with Knick-Knack, who, honestly, were he a wizard, I think would have been sorted in Hufflepuff himself. And finally, Hannah, you were chosen by Pilo, a chef who always takes charge in the Hogwarts kitchens. Each house elf appeared on top of the students' stations. Rose, like Colin, immediately moved to shake her elf's hand, but the other wizard-born students merely greeted them with pleasant smiles. Arjuna, said Bagnold, her tone swimming in the sort of dignified and restrained amusement that Harry had heard in Fudge's voice before. Your elf will be Diddy. She is the most loyal companion you could hope to find. For Astoria, we have Poppy, who is quick on her feet and sharp of mind. And Cho, you will be working with Reddy, who, true to his name, is ready to work and to win. All the Ravenclaw girls, being of magical heritage, merely greeted their elves politely when they appeared, though Cho gave her elf something of an abbreviated bow of the head, which pleased him greatly. And finally, boomed Slughorn jovially, to my students, my sweet Bridget, you'll be working with Hardy, a perfect rock of an elf, who will always be there to help with whatever you need. And my beautiful Daphne, your help will be Coco, who has written her own recipes for her fellow elves to use in the kitchens. And my dear Millicent, you will be working with Winky, in her words. There was no other chef she wanted to work with but you. When the Slytherins, elves, appeared, Bridget, like Colin and Rose, shook her elf's hand. To the surprise of everyone, however, Winky, upon appearing at Millicent's station, immediately started chattering to her excitedly, and Millicent actually smiled back. Winky didn't want to work with any other chef, but Millicent Bulstrode. Hermione couldn't help but repeat, dumbfounded. Why? Harry shrugged. Well, Winky was always sort of weird. I mean, her last owner was Crouch, and she would have set herself on fire for him. Hermione frowned disapprovingly at Harry. The teams are assembled, Ramsay finished dramatically. The judges' table is set, and the kitchen is calling. Magic F Jr. starts right now.